Hi there, this is Gerald M. Kilby again, and I'd like to firstly wish you all a Happy New Year. And in the words of John Lennon, let's hope this one is a good one. So this time around, I'm going to be talking about the science fiction subgenre cyberpunk. Yes, cyberpunk. Now, if the recent release of Cyberpunk 2077 is anything to go by, then the genre seems to be more popular than ever before. I mean, that game has sold over 13 million copies just in the first 2 weeks, and that's despite a pretty bad launch, along with a lot of refunds. So cyberpunk as a subgenre of science fiction is one that continues to appeal to people, and it seems that it is tapping into something in our collective psyche. So let's take a look at this fascinating slice of science fiction and ask a few questions like, what is cyberpunk, and where did it originate from, and why does it seem to resonate with us, and ultimately maybe can it tell us anything about our future?
Do you want to know what it is?
Now, it's generally accepted that cyberpunk as a genre really first emerged back in the 80s with the release of the film Blade Runner, and then about a year or so later with the publication of the book Neuromancer by William Gibson, and both of these are regarded as some of the best in science fiction in general. Now, William Gibson's novel, I would argue, laid most of the groundwork for the general themes of cyberpunk.
The sky above the port was the color of television, tuned to a dead channel.
Blade Runner, on the other hand, did most of the heavy lifting in terms of visualizing the now kind of familiar dark and gritty stylized aesthetic that we come to think of as cyberpunk. Now, I read Neuromancer over the holidays, and what struck me most about the story is just how fresh it is, considering it was first published back in July 1984, which is quite a long time ago, long before our current digitally interconnected world existed. Yet, the story could have been written yesterday, and I suppose in some ways it stands as a testament to William Gibson's vision of the future. Now, if you like cyberpunk as a genre and haven't read Neuromancer, I would highly recommend it. It's a great read. Now, the cyberpunk genre was further defined in the 90s with the novel Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson, another great sci-fi novel. And then in 1999 we had that uber stylish sci-fi blockbuster all wrapped in cyberpunk clothing, The Matrix. Now, cyberpunk as a kind of a big budget genre pretty much faded for a long time after that, and it seemed that it might really just be a passing fad. Then in 2013 we got Elysium, which was a kind of sequel to an excellent South African movie called District 9. And Elysium had a lot of cyberpunk elements to it. But it was really late in the sort of 2010s. We got a whole slew of big budget movies and shows, starting with the long anticipated sequel to Blade Runner. Along with that, we got Ghost in the Shell shortly afterwards. And then the following year we had the Netflix series Altered Carbon, based on a book by Richard Morgan, which is a great book actually, if you ever get a chance to read it. It's still one of my favourite sci-fi books of all time. Shortly after that, I think the following year, we got Alita Battle Angel, again another very cyberpunk big budget movie. And that essentially brings us right up to last month, when possibly one of the most hotly anticipated games of all times was launched, and that was Cyberpunk 77, proving in many ways that cyberpunk is more than a passing fad, and that the genre is not only here to stay, but it's more popular than ever. So why is this? Why is cyberpunk so popular? Well, to answer that, we need to look at some of the central themes of cyberpunk, and where better to start than punk itself. Now, I'm of an age, and it may come to you as a surprise, but I am of an age and from a certain part of the world that puts my early years pretty much slap bang in the inception of the punk phenomena. So I can give somewhat of a informed insight, having essentially experienced it up close. Now, in many ways, the punk was a visceral cultural reaction to the social and economic problems of the UK during the sort of mid-70s, where an entire generation of working class youth just felt they had no future. Now, this reaction manifested itself as a kind of anarchic DIY cultural FU to the establishment. You know, it was a complete and utter rejection of mainstream, and it allowed for a heady dose of personal empowerment. So all you needed was 3 chords and an attitude, and you could start a band and maybe, you know, take over the world. So in essence, it was a kind of class war, I suppose, a cultural revolution really, where the sort of totems of establishment were wheeled out and burned on the altar of punk rock stages. And it was also a cultural revolution that travelled, you know, it went global, you know, finding a home with a lot of other frustrated youth in many other industrialised countries across the world. And I suppose some of this may sound vaguely familiar to the issues we have today. But it's this kind of same anarchic street level individualism that gives cyberpunk its edge, I think. I mean, just swap out the safety pin for a bit of cool biotech and the guitar for a hacker deck, and you've pretty much got cyberpunk as it is today. Which leads us nicely on to technology. Now, technology is really at the heart of cyberpunk. You know, cyberpunk, it depicts this near future world where technology dominates every aspect of life, even to the point where it's become integrated with the human body. You know, it's a world that's addicted to tech, so much so that the boundaries between technology and biology become blurry, where some people essentially are more machine than meat. And in that sense, it sort of underscores the dehumanization of people and societies by this headlong rush to embrace technology. Now, this is a central theme in Blade Runner, if you remember, you know, where the bioengineered replicants are not seen as human. They're just seen as dangerous man-made machines that need to be terminated. Now, cyberpunk explores this loss of humanity in this increasing high-tech world. You know, it asks the question what it is that we lose when we embrace this unrestrained technological advancement. I mean, it's fundamentally a cautionary tale. Essentially, just because we can do something, does that mean we should? So you can see how a lot of this would resonate with our current tech-addicted world. Now, the stage for cyberpunk is always played out in the city, well, nearly always played out in the city. And it's a sprawling three-dimensional cityscape where the sort of rich live high up above the chaos of the common people, whisked away in their flying cars to live a life of luxury in the clouds. But the street is really where most of the action plays out. I mean, down there, you know, the bio-hacking shops sit side by side with noodle bars and seedy nightclubs, all wrapped up in this endless loop of intrusive and highly garish advertising. So this is a dark, teeming, neon-soaked urban society gorging on unrestrained capitalism and all the technological delights that it brings. It's a society that feels, you know, almost on the edge of complete collapse at any moment. I mean, the only thing keeping it together is sort of like the headlong rush of its own momentum. Which leads us into corporations. Now, everywhere in cyberpunk, the mega corporations loom over the people. You know, they sort of outmuscle the governments, and they write the rules by which everybody lives by. And these are essentially the undisputed bad guys in cyberpunk. If there's a nefarious plot afoot, you can be damn sure the corpos are behind it. You know, whether it's peddling some dodgy tech or funding some biohacking ring or starting just an all-out corporate war, they're the guys that are in there doing all this, and there's always a buck in it somewhere for somebody. In a sense, it's sort of, I suppose, capitalism unleashed and unrestrained. You know, where anyone gets in the way of the bottom line is essentially flatlined. Now, all this may seem very dark and dreary, but the genre still has one more trick up its cybernetically enhanced sleeve, and that's style. just pure, unadulterated cool. Now, ever since we saw Rachel walk across that marble floor in the Tyrell Corporation in Blade Runner, or when we saw Keanu Reeves and friends pop up in The Matrix, people have been utterly bewitched by the uber cool of the aesthetic of cyberpunk. Now, before I get into summing all this up and maybe drawing some conclusions, an interesting thing happened to me on the way to writing my next book in the Belt series. And yeah, I know, a bit of unabashed self-promotion here, but bear with me because it is actually quite relevant. Now, the Belt series is essentially, it's a near future space adventure. And the first 3 books are a trilogy. They're a complete trilogy. And then the 4th book, Enigma, starts a new series, a new trilogy. And it's set about 2 decades, 20 odd years after the events of the first. And I started rereading, because I'm writing the 5th book in the Belt series, so I went back to reread it. Now, I don't write cyberpunk, at least so I thought until I started rereading Enigma. And I don't know whether it's, I've been doing a bit of research for this video and immersing myself in the cyberpunk genre, that I hadn't noticed just how much of a cyberpunk novel Enigma actually is. We have we have an edgy tech nerd that's been hunted down by one of the mega corporations that controls the world. We have, the peace and stability of the solar system being upheld by a cohort of advanced quantum intelligences. I call them the QIs. Yet this world order is being undermined by a group of genetically enhanced humans, node runners, and they have the ability to jack into the grid and manipulate the data stream. So this is all very cyberpunk. Even the cover is cyberpunk. That's pretty cyberpunk. We even got a gun with an LED on it, which is very Blade Runner. So what's going on here, basically? How come, if I never thought I wrote cyberpunk, I am now seem to be writing, or the last book seemed to be very cyberpunk in its themes? Well, I think science fiction writers in general tend to take a lot of their source material from the technology of today, and then we sort of extrapolate that out along a timeline, and we highlight the wonders of this sort of future technological world, as well as the sort of dark side of technological hubris, I suppose. And along the way, we're sort of tapping into the sort of cultural anxieties of the time, and all essentially to make a more interesting story. So it is no wonder really that some of my later novels have that cyberpunk edge, because these are the issues that are kind of most relevant to us as a civilization at the moment. And we're talking issues like unrestrained technological advancement, an ever increasing interconnected world, the loss of privacy, where we're both the consumer and the product, megacorps that have the potential to sort of outmuscle governments and regulators. We have, we have foreign governments, state-sponsored hacking networks that hack into governments and corporations to steal their data and their secrets. And we have, a sector of the population that increasingly feels forgotten and ignored. So all these themes are fundamental to cyberpunk. In fact, I would go as far as to say that, considering the genre started back in the 1980s, the genre now seems to be very prescient. And you could argue that we've essentially arrived at the very future it predicted. Apart from maybe flying cars, we're still waiting on those.
Hey, Doc, you better back up. We don't have enough road to get up to 88.
Roads? Where we're going, we don't need roads.
So they're my thoughts on cyberpunk, and please bear in mind, they're just my thoughts. It's not meant as a definitive analysis on the genre, and some of it's a bit tongue-in-cheek. And there's many other valid analysis of cyberpunk out there. So take from it what you will and leave what you must, so to speak. But give me your thoughts below on what you think about cyberpunk as a genre. And also, give me some ideas on what other sci-fi genres I could take a deep dive into. And I'll leave some links in the description for some of the books I mentioned in the thing. Anyway, look, that's all I got time for this month. I got to get to writing that next book in the Belt series. So I'll see you all again next time. Do take care.